This is a map showing the distribution of U.S. overseas military bases. The United States maintains approximately 750 military bases abroad. These are spread across more than 80 countries and territories worldwide. They cover every major continent. The sheer number of U.S. bases is immense, and their distribution is incredibly vast. New bases are constantly being built, while others are closed. Furthermore, there are many classified bases that have never been disclosed. Neither the public nor even the U.S. military itself can pinpoint the exact real-time total. Today, the scale of the American global military machine is staggering. The number of its overseas bases far exceeds those of all other countries in the world combined. Roughly 170,000 active-duty U.S. troops are deployed across hundreds of these overseas sites. This force is nearly equivalent in size to the entire German army. It is almost certain that the U.S. currently controls more foreign military outposts than any other nation in human history. Combined with technological superiority and a massive budget, the U.S. military has become the most powerful armed force in the history of the planet. But what truly gives the U.S. global hegemony and makes it nearly impossible to challenge is not just technology, manpower, or financial wealth. It is the logistical capability provided by these 750 bases worldwide. The U.S. military places extreme importance on logistics. Years ago, after invading landlocked Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, in just a few short years, the Air Force transported an entire Mobile Burger King to the war zone for the soldiers. Not long after, Pizza Hut and Dairy Queen locations were established in the heart of Afghanistan. But regardless of where they are located, the controversy surrounding these hundreds of U.S. bases is growing. They trigger resentment in host nations and spark intense debate within the United States. Overseas U.S. bases fall roughly into two categories. The first are large, permanent main operating bases. These house more than 200 personnel. Construction costs usually exceed $10 million. The other category consists of small, temporary sites, known as Cooperative Security Locations or lily pad bases. They are more low-profile and discreet. Costs are under $10 million. They house fewer than 200 troops. They make up about 40% of the total. In Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, bases are relatively scarce. However, in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, they are highly concentrated. Germany currently has the highest density of U.S. bases and troops in the world. This is a legacy of Germany's defeat in World War II and West Germany's role as the front line against the Warsaw Pact. This deployment pattern has remained to this day. At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. had approximately 250,000 troops stationed in Europe. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Clinton administration closed dozens of bases in Europe. Troop levels were significantly reduced. By 2021, the U.S. presence in Europe had dropped to fewer than 64,000 troops. Roughly half of them were concentrated in Germany. But following the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the U.S. once again sent tens of thousands of additional troops to Europe. Today, there are about 100,000 U.S. soldiers in Europe. About 54,000 are deployed across various bases in Germany. The rest are in Italy, the UK, Poland, Spain, Romania, Kosovo, and other locations. The most important permanent U.S. base in Europe is Ramstein Air Base in western Germany. It serves as the headquarters for U.S. Air Forces in Europe. It is the heart of a massive network of U.S. facilities. It houses 54,000 U.S. military personnel and over 5,400 civilians. Ramstein plays a pivotal role in U.S. overseas military operations. It is a critical logistics hub for aircraft flying from the U.S. mainland. 2 missions in Africa and the Middle East. However, Ramstein is also deeply controversial. In 2015, it was revealed that without informing or obtaining consent from the German government, the U.S. used this base as a logistics hub to funnel weapons to the Syrian opposition. That same year, it was exposed as a key command center for drone strikes in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia under the Obama administration. The German government claimed it was unaware of these activities. In 2019, 3 Yemenis who lost family in a 2012 drone strike sued the German government. They accused Germany of allowing the U.S. to control drones from its territory. However, because the U.S. has full legal jurisdiction over Ramstein, Germany, even if it disapproves, finds it very difficult to regulate U.S. military actions within the base. This situation is common at many U.S. bases around the world. The second largest concentration of U.S. troops in Europe is in Italy. This presence centers on the U.S. 6th Fleet headquarters in Naples and the strategically vital naval air station, Sigonella, in Sicily. It houses around 4,000 U.S. troops. Located in the heart of the Mediterranean, it is a primary transit point for flights between the U.S., Middle East, and Indian Ocean. The U.S. also stationed the 31st Fighter Wing at Aviano Air Base in northern Italy. It is one of the few overseas U.S. bases that publicly stores nuclear weapons. One of the most controversial incidents in Italy occurred in 2003. He was moved to Aviano and then rendered to Egypt. He was held for 4 years without charge. 26 CIA personnel involved in the operation, including then Station Chief Jeffrey Castelli, were indicted by Italian prosecutors. In 2013, 10 years after the kidnapping, Castelli and 3 others were sentenced by an Italian court to 7 years in prison. However, none appeared in court, and the U.S. never extradited them to serve their sentences. The third largest U.S. military concentration in Europe is in the U.K. With over 10,000 permanently stationed troops, the largest sites are RAF Lakenheath and RAF Mildenhall in southeast England, 114 0 hours 10 minutes and 1 second, 800 0 hours 10 minutes and 5 seconds, 666 9 days later, Reagan ordered a retaliatory strike. 24 U.S. fighter jets took off from RAF. They flew around Europe, through Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean to bomb Libya, completing the longest fighter combat mission in U.S. military history. A 14-hour round trip, dropping 60 tons of bombs. The 6th Fleet, stationed in Italy, also provided support off the Libyan coast. Decades later, in 2011, U.S. aircraft from Mildenhall and Lakenheath again took part in strikes against the Gaddafi regime, enforcing the no-fly zone and bombing Libyan forces, ultimately leading to the fall and death of Gaddafi. U.S. air bases in the U.K., like others across Europe, are central to America's global defense strategy. Yet, they remain equally controversial. Another U.S. site in Britain, RAF, is a major communications hub for the U.S. Air Force in Europe, processing about 1/3 of all U.S. military communications. In 2019, an American woman working at the base, whose husband was a CIA officer, struck and killed 19-year-old Briton Harry Dunn while driving on the wrong side of the road. Days after the incident, she fled back to the U.S. using diplomatic immunity. She remains at large to this day, sparking diplomatic tensions between the UK and the US. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the density of US bases is second only to Germany. Japan and South Korea host the largest numbers of troops, with approximately 50,000 and 28,500 personnel respectively. Each country has dozens of bases. In fact, the largest overseas U.S. military base in the world is Camp Humphreys in South Korea. The scale of this base is massive, costing nearly $11 billion to build, roughly half of Brazil's entire annual military budget, covering about 14 square kilometers, about a quarter of the size of Manhattan. The base contains over 500 buildings, accommodating up to 45,000 Americans. The base is essentially an American town built in the heart of South Korea, highly Americanized. However, These bases remain highly controversial among the Korean public. The most famous incident occurred in 2002. A U.S. armored vehicle was returning to base after a training exercise. It struck and killed two 14-year-old South Korean schoolgirls walking to a birthday party. The two U.S. drivers were initially charged with negligent homicide in the U.S. military court. Korea requested the case be transferred to a Korean civil court. The U.S. military refused. Ultimately, the military court acquitted them. This sparked massive nationwide anti-American protests in South Korea. The controversy surrounding the U.S. military presence in Japan is even greater. As in Europe, U.S. forces have been stationed in Japan since the end of World War II. Today, Japan is the second largest host of overseas U.S. troops, with about 50,000 personnel spread across 85 bases, including Yokosuka, the headquarters of the U.S. 7th Fleet, located right at the entrance to Tokyo Bay. However, for decades, the most densely garrisoned area has been Okinawa. About 30,000 U.S. troops are permanently stationed on Okinawa. This number alone is second only to Germany, as the second largest overseas deployment for the U.S. globally. Okinawa is densely populated, with nearly 1.5 million people, yet approximately 25% of the land is entirely controlled by the U.S. military. It is one of the most disputed U.S. deployment sites in the world. For 26 years, from Japan's surrender in 1945 until 1971, Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands were under direct U.S. administration. Recognizing its strategic value, the U.S. built dozens of bases on the island, airfields and logistics facilities, turned it into America's most geostrategically valuable outpost in East Asia. Furthermore, with tens of thousands of troops concentrated on a small island, crimes committed by U.S. personnel have been widely reported. Statistics show that between 1972 and 2009, U.S. personnel in Okinawa committed 5,634 criminal offenses, including 25 murders, 385 robberies, 2,827 thefts, and 306 assaults. Japanese police agencies also found that U.S. personnel in Okinawa were 86% less likely to be convicted in Japanese courts than local residents. Besides East Asia and Europe, the third largest concentration of U.S. bases is in the Middle East, though the scale today is much smaller than its peak. At the peak, in 2011, there were over 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan alone, deployed across at least 10 bases. In 2007, Iraq hosted nearly 170,000 U.S. troops, roughly equal to the total overseas U.S. deployment in 2024. Since then, the U.S. has significantly reduced its Middle East presence, shifting its focus to the Asia. In 2021, all U.S. forces withdrew from Afghanistan. Troops in Iraq have been reduced to about 2,500, mostly concentrated in two bases maintained with the Iraqi government's permission. Today, there are only about 30,000 U.S. troops in the entire Middle East, equivalent to the number on Okinawa alone. The largest U.S. base in the Middle East is Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Following the 1991 Gulf War, after Qatar cooperated with the U.S. to drive Saddam's forces out of Kuwait, Qatar realized it was too small and vulnerable. It needed the protection of a superpower. Thus, it signed a defense cooperation agreement with the U.S. In 1996, it spent over $1 billion to build a secret air base for the U.S. military. The U.S. first used Al Udeid after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, deploying aircraft for the upcoming air campaign in Afghanistan. Since then, Al Udeid has become the central hub for U.S. operations in the Middle East, providing forward deployment for missions. in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Located in the middle of the Persian Gulf, facing Iran. It currently hosts about 11,000 U.S. troops, deploying B-1B strategic bombers and other assets. Remaining text continues with same logic. 256 021 to 51,733, 021 to 58,566. However, some bases are located in countries that explicitly do not welcome the U.S. military. These are far more controversial than others. For example, small U.S. military outposts in Syria, currently housing approximately 900 U.S. troops, they operate without the permission of the Syrian government. They primarily perform two missions. Two bases in northeastern Syria are in Kurdish-controlled areas supported by the U.S. They are used for transporting weapons, training Kurdish officers, and assisting in the fight against the Syrian government and ISIS. In south-central Syria, near the borders of Iraq and Jordan, the Al-Tanf base was established in 2016. It hosts only about 200 U.S. troops, but it is strategically critical. The U.S. has declared a 55-kilometer deconfliction zone around Al-Tanf. The base sits right on the Baghdad-Damascus M2 highway. This is one of only 3 major highways connecting Iraq and Syria. The other 2 routes further north are largely controlled by U.S.-backed Kurdish forces. This means that by using Al-Tanf to block the southern highway, the U.S. effectively severs all main corridors from Iraq to Syria. This in turn cuts off the land corridor used by Iran to supply weapons and personnel to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Therefore, Al-Tanf is strategically significant for supporting Israel by blocking the fastest land route between Iran and Hezbollah. Though Al-Tanf is small, it is the linchpin of this entire strategy. Unsurprisingly, the Syrian government flatly rejects the U.S. presence, viewing the Al-Tanf region as an illegal occupation. But Syria is not the only place where the U.S. maintains a base against the host country's wishes. In Cuba, there is Guantanamo Bay. This was America's first overseas military base. Established in 1903, it originated after the U.S. briefly occupied Cuba following the Spanish-American War in 1898. During the occupation, the U.S. added an amendment to the Cuban Constitution, allowing the U.S. to lease or buy land for naval bases. The U.S. subsequently leased the land at Guantanamo. The lease has no expiration date. Theoretically, Cuba holds sovereignty, but the U.S. maintains complete jurisdiction as long as it continues the lease. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the Castro government challenged the U.S. presence at Guantanamo, demanding the return of the land as an illegal occupation. For decades, the U.S. has consistently refused, insisting on the permanent lease established during the 1901 occupation. Under the agreement, the U.S. pays Cuba $4,500 in annual rent. Every year, the U.S. dutifully sends the check. Every year, Cuba refuses to cash it. Due to the decades-long U.S. trade embargo on Cuba, there is not a single McDonald's on the entire island, except for the one inside the Guantanamo base, which is beyond Cuban control. Used by roughly 8,500 Navy and Marine personnel after the 9/11 attacks, Guantanamo's role as a Caribbean naval base was redefined. George W. Bush issued a military executive order allowing for the indefinite detention of foreign terrorist suspects, without charges and without judicial recourse. In December 2000, the DOJ claimed Guantanamo was not U.S. territory, merely Cuban land leased by the U.S. The U.S. military set up a detention camp here in early 2000, holding hundreds of al-Qaeda and Taliban suspects, most of whom were captured during the war in Afghanistan. A total of 780 prisoners from dozens of countries have been held here. The U.S. government repeatedly argued that prisoners were not entitled labeling them unlawful enemy combatants. Of those 780 people, only 16 were ever formally charged with a crime. As of 2024, the Guantanamo detention camp remains operational, still holding 30 people, including several key figures involved in the 9/11 attacks. These individuals were captured by the CIA, transferred to highly classified CIA black sites around the world, and eventually brought to Guantanamo. These CIA black sites are among the USS highest secrets. Their exact locations remain almost entirely undisclosed, known only to a few top-level officials. Beyond these, on a remote island in the Indian Ocean, lies America's most controversial overseas military base. It is a narrow, small coral atoll with a total area of about 33 square kilometers, only half the size of Manhattan, situated in the center of the Indian Ocean. It is thousands of kilometers from any civilization. It is the world's largest coral atoll and the primary island of the Chagos archipelago in the British Indian Ocean Territory. Diego Garcia sits almost exactly at the geographic center of the Indian Ocean. Controlling it is equivalent to controlling the sea and air routes connecting East Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Over 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo and 2/3 of oil shipments pass through the Indian Ocean daily. Therefore, the geostrategic significance of a base here is immense. It serves primarily as a logistical support point for US warships and planes traveling between the Middle East and East Asia, and is one of America's most important strategic bomber bases. About 4,000 U.S. troops and DoD employees are stationed here, hosting top-tier strategic bombers like the B-52, B-1B, and the B-2 stealth bomber. This was once the world's most dense deployment site for B-2, South, stored in specialized climate-controlled hangars. All three types of bombers are nuclear. From this central location in Diego Garcia, bombers have participated in the 1991 Gulf War, strikes against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan after 9/11s, and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In addition to bombers, Diego Garcia stockpiles massive amounts of weaponry, ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Equipped with support ships, it can arm and sustain a Marine Expeditionary Unit of 16,000 personnel, allowing for rapid deployment to any point along the Indian Ocean rim, to operate independently for 30 days without further resupply. This dramatically enhances the U.S. military's rapid response capabilities. Being deep in the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers from potential enemies, it is very difficult for adversaries to counter U.S. deployments or actions here. Diego Garcia is not sovereign U.S. territory. Legally, it is a U.S. base within the British Indian Ocean Territory, used with the permission of the British government. Similar to Guantanamo, the U.S. leases rather than owns Diego Garcia. However, Britain's ownership of the island has been a subject of intense controversy for decades. Diego Garcia and the Chagos archipelago are also claimed by Mauritius. The issue dates back to the 1960s, when Mauritius was still a British colony, preparing for independence. Mauritius had been colonized by Britain for a century and a half, since 1810. During that time, the remote Chagos Islands were legally under Mauritian jurisdiction. The U.S. realized Diego Garcia could serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier and logistics hub in the heart of the Indian Ocean. Just before Britain granted Mauritius independence, it carved the Chagos archipelago away from Mauritius. In 1965, it established the British Indian Ocean Territory as a separate entity. 3 years later, Mauritius gained independence, but without the Chagos Islands. This action was a flagrant violation of UN Resolution 1514, which explicitly prohibits colonial powers from dismembering a colony's territory before independence. Despite this, the U.S. encouraged Britain to retain Chagos so that Diego Garcia could be leased to the U.S. for a base. The U.S. also lured Britain with a discount on the purchase of nuclear weapons. Most controversially, the U.S. demanded Diego Garcia be cleared of all inhabitants for secrecy, restricting it to authorized military personnel only. Britain, fearing the U.S. might lease other islands in the future. In the early 1970s, approximately 2,000 Chagosians were rounded up by the British and exiled, mainly to Mauritius and the Seychelles. They received no compensation or assistance. They and their descendants mostly live in extreme poverty today. To avoid reporting colonial rule to the United Nations, Britain falsely claimed at the time that the Chagos Islands had no permanent residents, after thousands were forcibly deported. That claim became a fact on paper. Britain has repeatedly denied the Chagosian people the right to return home, citing base security and prohibitive resettlement costs. Since independence, Mauritius has consistently asserted sovereignty over Chagos and Diego Garcia. In 2017, the International Court of Justice took up the Chagos sovereignty dispute. In 2019, it issued a landmark ruling. Britain's 1965 separation of Chagos from Mauritius was illegal under international law. The decolonization of Mauritius was never lawfully completed. The British Indian Ocean Territory should be returned to Mauritius as soon as possible. In 2020, the UN General Assembly adopted the ICJ ruling, demanding Britain end its colonial administration within 6 months. Official UN maps began labeling the Chagos archipelago as Mauritian territory. To date, Britain has ignored and rejected all such demands. The United States has remained silent on the matter. Leasing the base from a reliable Britain is far more advantageous than dealing with a Mauritius that might one day demand a U.S. withdrawal. Should they withdraw, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy would be severely weakened. The controversy also extends to whether the U.S. stores nuclear weapons on Diego Garcia. The U.S. government neither confirms nor denies this. But as all strategic bombers deployed, there are It is widely believed that nuclear weapons are indeed present. The problem is that in 1996, all African nations signed the Palindaba Treaty, declaring the entire African continent a nuclear weapon-free zone, permanently and explicitly banning nuclear weapons. The treaty includes Mauritius and identifies the Chagos archipelago as Mauritian territory. Therefore, the nuclear-free zone covers the entire including Diego Garcia. This means that once Mauritius recovers Diego Garcia, even if it allows the U.S. base to remain, it would likely be bound by the treaty to ban U.S. nuclear storage on the island. In recent sovereignty negotiations, Mauritius has expressed willingness to offer the U.S. a 99-year lease to continue operating the strategic base. But the U.S. response is that it will only accept unhindered operation of the base. The subtext is that nuclear weapons must be allowed. Britain clearly acquiesced. Thus, Britain and the U.S. stand together, ignoring almost the entire international consensus, appearing profoundly hypocritical when condemning similar actions by other nations. In 2023, the situation worsened. Human Rights Watch released a landmark report, concluding that the forced displacement of thousands of Chagosians by the UK and US in the 1970s constitutes a crime against humanity. That if the Chagosian people and their descendants are allowed to return, thousands of civilians will appear on Diego Garcia, which is currently strictly off-limits to civilians. Diego Garcia is one of the U.S. military's most secret bases. Its location is remote. All entrants must be U.S. military or DoD employees, with explicit authorization from the base commander. Even family members of service personnel are not allowed to accompany them. And that it served as an ideal remote location for CIA black sites during the War on Terror. Therefore, the U.S. has every reason to keep outsiders away as much as possible, even if it means continuing to deny the Chagosians their right to return, perpetuating a colonial crime alleged to be a crime against humanity. This is why, among hundreds of overseas U.S. military bases, Diego Garcia is arguably the most controversial of all.